Okay, well, so thank you very much. It's great to be having this session with you. My name is Duncan Caspegs. I'm the Counselor for Strategic Foresight here at the OECD in Paris, and I'm also delighted to be joined by a couple of members of my teams, Dexter and Akane, who are also here. So what I want to do is, if it works, a little, there we go, is really take you through three things in the coming few minutes. The first is just a few words about the OECD and foresight at the OECD. Secondly, about some of the work that we, but also our government foresight community members around the world are doing particularly in the area of foresight for COVID-19. And then third, just some words about actually building foresight capacity within your own organizations and governments. So first of all, as many of you know, the OECD is an international organization based in Paris. It is 38 member countries currently, and its slogan is better policies for better lives. So within the OECD, we are a foresight unit working out of the Secretary General's office with a mandate to really build the capacity for foresight and futures thinking across the organization. Secondly, with governments by working in collaboration with them. And thirdly, by bringing strategic foresight into key areas of global dialogue, be that ministerials or others. A key part of this, our main challenge is really to address the issue that there's an incredible amount of excellent policy analysis and advice being conducted at the OECD itself, and of course within member country governments. But still too often, our view is that this analysis is not sufficiently taking a future forward-oriented view and perspective, or integrating sufficiently a consideration of the range of futures that we could face. And so we're really trying to come in and work with our colleagues to build foresight practices in order to strengthen their own work and analysis and their value to members. An important part of the global dialogue is also the government foresight community that we chair, the global government foresight community, and I will tell you a little bit more about that later on. But much of what I'll be saying in this presentation is drawn from the experience of our over 200 members around the world and what they have been doing in their countries to develop their foresight practices and capacities. So that was what it looked like before. This is, of course, what it looks like now. As we are all on Skype, we have found, or on Zoom or various platforms, we have found that actually the transition to virtual has got a number of advantages as well, including being able to be here all with you today. The commute from my kitchen to the Philippines was relatively easier than had I had to fly. So as Arndt has covered, strategic foresight is really an approach to think systematically about the future in order to inform decision-making today. At the OECD, we view this as primarily not about predictions and forecasts, although there's an important dimension of that as well at the OECD. But in our practice, it's particularly about exploring and preparing for alternative plausible futures. Why do we do this? Why is it so important for public policy making? Well, it's about future-proofing our policies and strategies. It's about identifying new opportunities and challenges. And it's about spurring innovative solutions as well in the actual policy development and implementation space. And then why now? So it's always been a good idea to bring foresight into policy. But in times such as present, wherein you're in incredibly high uncertainty, rapid change, we argue that really this is a core element of responsible policymaking. It's not a luxury, it's part of the due diligence that we owe to our political masters and to citizens, that they know that we have actually actively engaged with alternative scenarios and what it could mean in our policy areas. And that means, first of all, proactively engaging, asking ourselves, looking beyond the present, looking to 5, 10, 15 years ahead. It means, secondly, imagining, preparing for the unexpected, the scenarios that are not on the radar yet. And then it means using that to inform decisions by designing adaptive, forward-looking strategies and policies for action. So that brings me to the next section, which is why really now, which is of course this tsunami of foresight work and interest as a result of COVID, which you've all been seeing. And that's of course related not only to the response to the COVID crisis, but also to thinking about the recovery and beyond. So at the OECD, we've done a significant chunk of work in this area, some of which can be found in the COVID guide that we put out in June. This document looks at, from a high level global perspective, what are some of the key uncertainties across multiple systems, and then some of the potential possible surprising developments that could emerge and what the implications for policy could be. So just to give you some examples of those, and these are some of the more obvious ones, and yet that have still not, I don't believe, been fully thought through in terms of what they could mean in various policy areas for governments and organizations around the world. So for example, what if we see a real increase in deglobalization and, as we're seeing now, digital decoupling, not only between China and the United States, but between other countries, regions as well? Could we find ourselves in various scenarios within 10 to 15 years where we wake up and see that we've actually emerged into various parallel digital clusters that are increasingly separate, trading, migration clusters as well, investment clusters, where it's increasingly difficult to work across them? And what would the implications of this be for a number of our current areas of policy thinking, including our own choices around digital infrastructure investments in all of our countries? What if the crisis, as we're seeing now, accelerates an increase in the concentration of corporate power, of consolidation of businesses around the world, with large firms consolidating, but also particularly advantages accruing in those who are in the digital space? What if we see a debt crisis? This is one that is, people have argued, is the tipping time bomb that we've yet to acknowledge as a result of the COVID crisis, where we could see a potential for sovereign debt defaults really within a number of, not only within emerging economies, but within a number of economies around the world. And then also, of course, the well-known potential for that to result in cascading bankruptcies in the financial sector. Then another one, which is this one about what if virtual life accelerates? So we're all participating in virtual life today. The tech companies are making very large investments in the next generation of that, where we will all be stepping into virtual reality workplaces that are even more engaging than just a simple Zoom conversation like this. What if also what if that allows us to really work anywhere from anywhere? What does that mean for our labor market policies, for the competitiveness of our businesses, for innovation, of course, but also for issues around where people choose to live, urbanization patterns, patterns of migration, and so forth? This is one that's got just an almost incalculable level of cascading implications. And that is no longer science fiction to think that this could be really a significantly increasing area affecting most countries and most of the population in the coming decades. Also potentially driven or leading to a significant push by citizens that want that kind of global connection, potentially a countervailing force to the kind of decoupling that I was mentioning earlier. And then, of course, so many other developments. And as we look beyond the sort of 10 to 15-year perspective, even further out, we can see the potential, of course, for cascading environmental emergencies, multiple tipping points, the commercialization of space, then both the huge advantages, but also new risks that raises. And then, of course, we're on the cusp of this potential question around the transition from narrow to general artificial intelligence. So that's just a sampling, but I think the point that we're trying to make is that these, in both as one's thinking through one's short-term responses, but particularly one's longer-term investments, we need to be asking ourselves these questions. what are some of the possible future developments that could disrupt your government's responses and recovery plans in the short and medium term? How do those raise new opportunities and challenges? In some cases, thinking through these different scenarios really helps you to see not only negative outcomes that one needs to see how one can mitigate or adapt to, but also new opportunities that one can start sooner preparing for, to build and to seize. And then what steps can be taken now to make policies more responsive and adaptable? And I think I want to stress here that I think, and we're moving our work and our thinking now, and a number of our member governments are as well, really into this space now about applying foresight, particularly to future-proofing recovery plans. And I want to emphasize, I think this is a really historic opportunity now. We are on the cusp of seeing our governments around the world investing trillions of dollars and equivalent in rebuilding their economies out of this. This may be a once-in-a-generation surge of investment in a number of countries, and it will have a structuring impact on the shape of our economies and societies and our governments for decades to come. Therefore, it's incredibly important that we get that right, and that even in this period where there's a lot of rush, and there will continue to be a lot of rush to get this sort of money out the door, to get things restarted, we have to make sure that we're bringing the perspective to our governments of saying, wait, we need to build into that process an investment in strategic foresight that will help make sure that we're making the right decisions, that we're making the right investments, that we're making the right policy reforms, so that we're not waking up in 10, 15 years and saying, oops, we didn't get that right, and now we don't have time to go back and fix it because we really committed ourselves to one direction. So what does that involve? What does it involve to help future-proof recovery plans? And I think it involves three things. The first is really to align your investments and reforms with your long-term goals. And this is the part that I think has been on the radar of political leaders. We've heard, I think from the first week of the pandemic, this idea of we need to build back better. We need to make sure that any investments that we're making coming out into the recovery are aligned with sustainability, with building a more inclusive society, and so forth. And the OECD's own ministerial council meeting came out with a declaration very much in that direction. And this is really positive to see, making sure that it's almost like a veto, that we're not making investments that are not going to be also serving those long-term goals. So that's a great start, but we need to keep pushing on that, and of course helping our governments to do that and giving them the tools. But the second piece is the one that I think is not getting enough attention, and that foresight, it's really important that foresight brings, and that's about stress testing whatever the long-term plans and these investments, and stress testing them against a range of different plausible scenarios, such as some of the ones I was just mentioning to you. So that is critical, and we need to be building that into the decision-making, the thinking and the decision-making process now. And then finally, it's also about asking ourselves now, how do we make the investments that are going to help strengthen the longer-term capacity of our governments to be what we call, to be implementing strategic foresight on an ongoing basis, to be conducting what we call anticipatory governance for the long term. And that's the point I wanted to turn to just finally, as we, in the last section of this, before we go on. I will skip over this for the rest of time, just in case, of course, the key steps of a foresight study, potential ones, and many of you are familiar with this. Some top tips, I can come back to this in the questions if desired, but I want to focus on this now. At our recent annual Government Foresight Community, we had a session on sort of identifying the top 7 practices for building world-class anticipatory governance. And we were brainstorming about, what is really the state of the art in this around the world. And I guess I want to make 2 points in general. One is that even though we have some incredibly advanced countries around the world who've been making investments over decades in building their strategic foresight capacity in government, even there, they were admitting that, of course, they're far from reaching the ideal. It's a continuing challenge to rise to how one can be improving and building a stronger overall foresight system. And so there's a continued collective goal of the global government foresight community to be seeing how we can work together to strengthen both the ideas for what's needed here and also supporting each other in our efforts to bring that about within our own governments. But the other point I want to make is that really there are, wherever you are coming from, wherever your government is at, there are manageable first steps that can be made to be strengthening across any or all of these areas, to be getting that sort of first step on the rung in an area that one's not already doing, if that's required. And so I won't go through all of these, but just to mention that they are, this involves everything from clarifying what's the purpose of strategic foresight. It's about making sure that you have the incentives that are actually going to drive that through across your public sector and policymaking system, that there are the practices there, everything from horizon scanning to scenario planning and visioning, but ideally built on a really ongoing basis so that this is not just one-offs. That there's strong participation in the processes, which is a key element of strategic foresight, ideally at all levels of decision makers. That the institutions themselves are in place, whether that's having a central strategic foresight unit, building out to that sort of capacity existing in all ministries and even beyond the government in society as well. And it means strengthening the capacities, both through hiring and through training, and ultimately a variety of conversations that help build the future's literacy of public servants and also of the broader public. And finally, it is about collaboration at both the national level and regionally and globally. And that's the point I want to end on really here, is to just say that we've had a tremendous experience through our work, as I mentioned, hosting this global government foresight community. But we really think there's a need to strengthen and enrich that by seeking to build foresight communities elsewhere in the world, wherever one can, to be deepening that within various regional areas. The European Union has just announced yesterday the creation of a European foresight network for member nation states. And I think there's a continued need for that in various parts of the world, and I would encourage you to continue, and we would be pleased to continue with you in discussions such as today's within the Asia Pacific region or subsections of it. And I think there is an important need to have discussions such as this, really bringing public sector and government foresight practitioners together to have a slightly different conversation than what will be had necessarily as part of the kind of broader APFN and other discussions, and both to share insight and priorities, but also to find ways to collaborate to advance this shared goal of anticipatory governance. Works best when it's highly interactive, participatory, and member-driven, but one, of course, does need conveners and a secretariat to make it happen. And finally, just in terms of how you can collaborate with us, I would emphasize one thing. Please do reach out if you are interested in joining the Global Government Foresight community that is open to full-time foresight practitioners working in the public sector. So do please connect with us. But also I would emphasize that we are particularly interested in building our collaborations around the third bullet here, which is really partnering with the OECD and one of our substantive directorates around a particular thematic future study or issue. This would particularly be an area where your country or your government is interested in pursuing foresight in a thematic area where you think there would be a potential significant benefit from bringing a global perspective and expertise that the OECD can provide. So with that, these are some ways that you can get in touch with us, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.